Welcome back, everyone. I want to talk today about a topic that I'm coining the two worlds. I don't know, the two worlds problem, the two worlds theory. Okay, and I think it's a really important thing for people who are interested in relocating from one country to another to understand this two worlds paradigm. Very, very important. And I will contextualize it by referring to Germany, but it's not just Germany. It is, many, many sort of what I'll call first world countries, and contrasting it with, in this particular case, we'll choose Mexico, but the truth is, again, there are many, many countries on the opposite, on kind of the other side. And the idea here is I often talk to clients who come from places like Germany. I've got lots of clients from Germany and from places like that. And they come and they're saying, hey, listen, I'm interested in moving to pick some place like Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Argentina, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., right? A variety of different places. And they're interested in knowing about the rules in that country. Perfectly reasonable. Smart to play by the rules of the jungle that you're in, right? They say, when in Rome. On the flip side, you also have the opposite, right? Which is people come from countries like, for example, union countries. This, I would say there's kind of like, since the integration with the EU, for a lot of these countries, maybe less of a thing, but certainly immediately after there, you definitely saw this trend. People move over. And they sort of apply a set of rules from their past to their new home and don't really understand that it's quite different. This is maybe very well exemplified by the movie House of Gucci, when one of the Gucci family ended up in the US and was practicing things in the US that, frankly, they could get away with in Italy, but the US was a different jungle. So what am I talking about here? What I'm talking about here is that there are certain countries that are what I would call land of law, where the rules that you have on the books are the rules in real life. Okay, so in Germany, in Netherlands, in Australia, in Denmark, in places like this, you should know the laws and you should be very attentive to the details of those laws and following them as prescribed, because that is exactly what you're going to face. And if you're in violation of them, there's a big problem for you. Okay? And so somebody who comes from that part of the world will tend to think, okay, if I'm going to Mexico, I should have the same mindset. But the thing is that Mexico is not a land of law. A lot of these countries are not a land of law. If you go down to Argentina, okay, they've had change over their president and things like this, so let's go kind of pre that. Let's say over the last 10 years, what you would find, for instance, is that there are exchange controls. There's a certain exchange rate. Well, guess what? The exchange rate that is official is not the real exchange rate. Okay, these two things have nothing to do with each other, or very little to do with each other. There's a black market rate, and that is what you really need to know: is the black market rate, not the formal rate. Which, by the way, is a little bit of a similar thing in Russia with the ruble. Okay, so you can have the official exchange rate and you can have the real exchange rate. And you have to know what the real exchange rate is. And you kind of take for granted, if you're coming from Germany and you're thinking about the exchange rate between US dollars and euros, that the exchange rate is the exchange rate. And you think, oh, great, Argentinian pesos, the exchange rate is the exchange rate. No, 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 no. That is not the exchange rate. Because there are two worlds here. And the second world is sort of this, black market is not the right word. It's a world where, for example, connections matter a lot, okay? So in a rule of law country, connections shouldn't matter. So it shouldn't really matter that much. And of course, yes, there's corruption in every country and things like this. You can find it in Germany, you can find it in Denmark, you can find it in Canada, etc. But as a share of what goes on, it's relatively small. You can relatively rely on what the actual rules are. And there are systems to enforce those rules. And if somebody tries to subvert that, you can go to courts, and you have like a process around this. Well, in some of these countries, the way that it works is like whoever knows the judge and can pay off the judge is going to get what they want. And you might say, oh, great, I have a problem with this person here. No problem, I'm going to sue them. And you realize that it doesn't really work that way. Very, very important to understand this, okay? It is important to understand which type of country you are in and what the rules are. So I've said frequently that Mexico, for example, is a high-tax country where nobody pays any taxes. Well, this is a shocking thought if you're coming from Australia, right? In Australia, that's not the way that it is. In Australia, the ATO are super aggressive. You better pay your taxes. Whatever they say the taxes are, that's what the taxes are. There's no debate. Well, in some of these places, it's like, well, when the inspectors show up, you pay them off and off you go. That's just a different type of world, right? And you can criticize it one way or the other. I remember back in the day, I was involved with some large companies that were doing international stuff in kind of like industrial grade projects, et cetera. And there was really big programs on US companies to have them not participate in corruption in some of these other countries. And you can say, okay, we can try and impose those rules, et cetera. But the reality at the end of the day is that that's the way business is done in those countries. If you want to get things done, this is how you get things done, because the system is dysfunctional normally. And so I think one of the first lenses that you should take is not just what are the rules, but you should say, like, what kind of place am I going to? How do things actually work on the ground there? Is it important that I have connections? If so, I better spend a bunch of time when I get there building some connections. Is it important that I understand that there are 2 exchange rates? If so, I better learn about that. On the other hand, the opposite is also true. Am I going to a place where actually no, connections don't do much for me? There are some places where people go to and they think like, oh, hey, I should be able to bribe people, right? No, you cannot do this. And that can give a very different lens to what it means to choose the best place for you to relocate to. Because for certain businesses, you may be able to gain some advantage that isn't an advantage that's a surface advantage, but when you dig in, helps you out. It's the same in reverse if you're talking about investing. So for example, I'll do a bunch of hard money lending. And when we're doing hard money lending, it's against first mortgages on properties, et cetera. I would not lend into certain places because I don't know that I can claim my collateral. I've talked before about how it was so true that returns were so high in these banana republics that people would go and move all their capital there and they'd make all these great returns. The truth is that the people who are there are taking their capital out of those places and moving it to places where they can rely on the rule of law. And that's because of the fact that this turns out to be really important in terms of generating investment returns. So here I'm loosely generalizing, right? I'm giving you Germany and Mexico as 2 examples. Of course, there is some spectrum on which all these countries exist, right? But it's very important to understand where it is that you are going. And I spend a lot of time working with clients to understand what the actual rules by the book are. That's very important. And helping clients to figure out, okay, how do you follow the rules by the book? And that's useful. There's a clear advantage to that. But the truth is also that we're typically not dealing with nearly so many clients from places where the rules are not fixed, because those people are doing other things to get around the rules. And you might enjoy that type of situation better. That's fair. That is what it is. But what you need to be understanding is that can also change. And we've seen this in a bunch of cases. So let's use Georgia as an example. Georgia used to be a super corrupt country. Then they brought in this big anti-corruption regime, and all of a sudden, what previously was the case was no longer the case. I'm here in Bulgaria today. Bulgaria, if you were to go back to 2008 or something, you could go and buy passports for $5,000 very easily. Was it legal? Well, it was a legal passport. The process was not a normal process. But did it work? Yes. They were giving out hundreds of passports per month. And that was a great opportunity for people to take advantage of. And people shockingly did not lose those passports afterwards, with only one exception that I'm aware of. So, people thought that's the way it is. Well, guess what? That changed. And today, corruption for normal people is quite low. They've done a lot to clean this up. Now, is it zero? Of course, it's not zero. Again, there's some spectrum, right? But it can even get to the opposite side. I have a friend in Sweden who likes to drive a Lamborghini, gets pulled over by the police a lot because, there's a whole thing where, hey, he might be stealing money. You hear this in Denmark quite a bit, right? People will get pulled over with an expensive car. Police say we need to make sure they're paying their taxes because we all have to do our fair share. I mean, very, very different environment. So these things are not really reflected in what you see on paper. But I think as you become more worldly and as you start to deal with different environments, et cetera, you start to realize that this is the case. And I think that it's a bad idea to try and resist the laws of the jungle that you're in. The idea is to understand which jungle you're in and then learn to play according to those rules. So anyway, I find this is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, so I figured it was worth sharing. If you have questions about it, put them in the comments below. Share experiences that you've had. I'm sure there's a bunch of people who can share all kinds of crazy things they've gone through in one part of the world or another, for better or for worse, and would love to hear them. So please share them, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.